Ja bih pozvala kolegu Gordana Dunsirea, nadam se da je s nama, koji će nam izložiti, naravno na engleskom, rad Ontology in Practice, Implementing the Library Reference Model. Gordon? Thank you.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me okay.
Everything is fine.
Thank you for inviting me yet again to AKM. I'm very, very pleased to be talking to you again and to see so many good friends and colleagues, even if it's in tiny little Zoom windows. So hi to everybody. So I'm going to talk about how you get from an ontology to something practical that people can use in libraries, archives, and museums. Using the IFLA library reference model as the case study. So I'm going to cover the concepts of models, ontologies, and how they fit into the ecosystem for bibliographic metadata. I'm going to use linked data kind of examples throughout because the library reference model itself is optimized for linked data. In particular, the library reference model has been implemented in RDA resource description and access, and that is pretty well complete. And in ISBD, which is very much underway. So I'm not really going to talk much about ISBD during this talk. I think Mirna will go into that later. I'm going to talk about how you align entities between an operational ontology and a model ontology. And I'll concentrate on manifestation and agent entities because manifestation is the one common entity between the LRM, RDA, and ISBD. I'll also talk a bit about mechanisms for aligning relationships between entities at high level, at low level, and using shortcuts. And finally, I will discuss the role of national agencies in creating these practical applications. So the bibliographic metadata ecosystem, this is a schematic diagram of it. It doesn't matter what kind of metadata you are creating. If it's to be effective, it could be a catalog card, a traditional bibliographic record, or indeed a linked data graph. But no matter what kind of packaging you're doing, you need to account for the structure of the metadata. That includes what entities and elements are being included in the description, what their characteristics are, and what the relationships between entities are. This metadata structure, when formally presented, is known as an ontology. The word ontology itself has multiple meanings, but this is what I will refer to as an ontology. As well as the structure, you need to have guidelines on how to complete filling in the structure with actual descriptive content. This is going to consist of stipulations, instructions, guidance, and good practice guidelines, etc. And finally, it all needs to be encoded in some kind of encoding syntax so that the data can be stored, displayed, exchanged, etc. So the structure, the content, and the format are the three functioning components of well-formed and useful metadata. So how do we get from a model like the library reference model, which is effectively an ontology? We need to get from there to a practical application. The library reference model clearly states that it's not intended to be implemented directly it needs additional work done on it before it becomes practical. It is, after all, a model. So the LRM, or the model ontology, provides definitions of entities, their characteristics in terms of attributes, and the relationships between them. A model will also indicate any restrictions on relationships. Is the relationship one to many, many to one, one to one, etc. This is known as cardinality. And that gives you the basic structure of the metadata that you will create under this model. From that, we need to derive an operational ontology, an ontology that can actually be used in practice directly. This is variously known as an element set or operational ontology, etc. It's likely at this stage of the process that we have to define or refine additional entities, subtypes of existing model entities. We may need to refine the elements, the attributes and relationships in the model ontology, again using subtypes, and we may wish to add additional constraints to the model constraints. The result is an operational ontology. We can then move on to tackle the second component of the ecosystem, the content guidelines. They will typically cover sources of information, how to actually transcribe or normalize values, and they will often have specific guidelines for specific types of content based on resource format, or indeed the structure of the metadata that's coming from the element set. So there is a dependency here between the content guidelines and the element set itself. At the same time, or after that, in fact, it's a good idea to have the content guidelines formulated first. We can move on to the third component of the metadata ecosystem, the encoding format. I'm not going to say anything more about that. However, for a wide area global model ontology and its implementation, it is likely, highly likely, that not all of the entities, elements, constraints, content guidelines are going to be applicable to the particular resource that is being cataloged at any one time. And so we have this concept of an application profile, which will select from the element set and the content guidelines which of the entities and elements and guidelines are relevant to the particular resource that is being cataloged in hand. So you might have different content guidelines for manuscript materials from materials that have been printed through mechanical processes. So this kind of layer cake is the set of stages from taking a model and implementing it in a very practical way. So one of the first things that we have to do when we look at the model and decide whether it has the correct entities for our application, we have to align the entities that we need in our local ecosystem with the entities that are being presented in the model, which is a global ecosystem in terms of the LRM. The LRM is attempting to model the universe of human discourse, as it says. It's quite wide-ranging. So this is the entity hierarchy for the agent entity in the LRM. It's in the middle of the hierarchy. It has a higher, broader entity called res, which means anything. And it has a more refined type of agent, subtype, which is called collective agent. These are linked by an ontological relationship. You don't have to worry about this. It's technical, and the computer people know all about this. But the collective agent is declared as a subtype or subclass of agent, and agent is a subclass of res. This is the corresponding hierarchy of entities in RDA. Again, agent is in the middle of a hierarchy, and it does have a subtype for collective agent. But the top of the hierarchy is something called RDA entity, not res, and there doesn't appear to be much of a connection between them at first sight. RDA also has a subtype of collective agent called family. So this hierarchy can be represented using exactly the same relationships. Here comes the neat, tricky part. We can then cross-relate using exactly the same subtyping relationship, subclass relationship. We can cross-relate the corresponding entities between RDA and the LRM. It is good practice to assume that the model entities are going to be equal or broader in scope to the operational entities. And that's why traditionally you always go from your implementation to the model and treat the model as being a broader or superclass type of entity. However, if the library reference model decided that it wanted to tighten the connections with RDA, this is highly unlikely, but it's certainly potential, then it can declare itself that the LRM entities are subtypes of the RDA entities, and the result of this is to make them equivalent. So if this diagram is fully implemented, it means in semantic terms that LRM agent is equivalent to RDA agent, and the same for collective agent. You will notice, however, that you cannot say that LRM res is a subtype of RDA entity. It isn't. RDA entity is deliberately a subtype of res and not the other way around, and they will never be equivalent. So that's roughly how entities are aligned. If we now look at relationship elements between the entities, the LRM provides us with a very high-level relationship. It basically says that something is associated with some other thing, which is about as broad a statement as you can make. That's represented here, again, by a linked data diagram. Actually, the association relationship in the library reference model is called symmetric. What that means is it has its own inverse. So the first res is associated with the second res, but the second res is also associated with the first res. This may sound very trivial, but this kind of very dumb statement is required for machine processing. Machines are incapable of thinking for themselves. The LRM does not explicitly state this, but in its introductory chapters, it clearly indicates that this relationship can be cascaded down the entity hierarchy. Res is the top level entity in the LRM. So the association relationship can, in principle and in practice, be cascaded down to pairwise relationships between any two LRM entities. I've chosen manifestation and agent. The LRM also provides an explicit creation association between manifestation and agent. Again, this is high level, and it is implied that this is a subproperty of the association relationship, but because that is not explicitly declared, neither is this subproperty relationship. We can now switch over to the the RDA element relationship hierarchy. And RDA also has very high association relationships, but for the purposes of this discussion, I will start with the creator of manifestation relationship, which is clearly a sub-property of the LRM relationship. It's part of an element chain, an element hierarchy, sorry, and it is explicitly declared in RDA that creator person of manifestation is a subtype of creator agent of manifestation. This is the same cascade mechanism between entity hierarchies that the LRM uses. So just using, again, just like subclass of, we can use this ontological property, subproperty of, to bridge between the relationship hierarchies of RDA and the LRM. At the top of the hierarchy, things are fairly fixed, and the whole of potential association space is completely filled by that res associated with res high-level relationship. But at the bottom of the hierarchy, it can be extended as much as is required. And this is an interesting decision point for many implementations. So remember from the previous diagram that the RDA creator person relationship is a subproperty of the LRM created relationship. That's indicated here by the upwards arrow. This is the next level of the RDA hierarchy. RDA, unlike the LRM says nothing further about the creator of a manifestation. RDA splits this into two subtypes. It's dependent on how the manifestation itself is produced. So RDA has a relationship for unpublished manifestations. That is manifestations that have not been published by a mechanical process. And it has a separate relationship for manifestations that have been published by a mechanical process. So this is clearly an extension of the LRM and is providing much more practical relationships that can be used in real-world metadata. The RDA hierarchy extends down the publisher branch of this particular area and has a specific legacy element, as it turns out, for broadcaster. When RDA implemented the LRM, it decided it would not throw out any relationships or other elements that were deemed useful. And so broadcaster person was retained and is clearly a refinement of publisher person. But this process can be extended indefinitely. And so it could be in the future, there is a requirement to specifically describe the role of somebody who podcasts. And so we might have a new entity, new element, sorry, called podcaster person. And this would fit into the hierarchy here. And all of this is being done using a single ontological relationship property called subproperty of. So the actual mechanics of this are fairly simple. Shortcut relationships are very useful in implementing with legacy elements. A shortcut element directly relates two entities that are already related via one or more intermediate entities. So we can have a chain of relationships between four entities here. They're related in a chain like this. The relationships between each pair of entities can be completely different, but a shortcut basically replaces all the intermediary relationships and entities with a single direct relationship between the first entity and the last entity in the chain. In this example, the shortcut means that nothing is recorded about the nature of entity B or entity C. This is great for simplifying the model or the operational ontology. It means complex pathways can be reduced to a single relationship. However, the intermediary data is not recorded, and therefore the end result is a dumbing down of the metadata. That's the trade-off in a shortcut. As I said, it's very useful for aligning legacy relationship elements with a new ontology. And here's a fairly obvious example from RDA. RDA has always had a relationship that directly relates a work to its manifestation. But when we implement the LRM, we discover the LRM has no such relationship element. But what we do determine is that, in fact, this is a shortcut for the standard relationship from a manifestation to an expression to its work. So has work manifested as a chain of has expression manifested and then has work expressed. The important point here is that the expression is not recorded. This may or may not be a good thing. If you are working in a multilingual library, archive, or museum, this is not a good thing because language is recorded at the expression entity. And if you need to record languages, you need to record expressions. But if you're working in a monolingual library, then maybe it's not required, but that's an implementation decision. So finally, where do national organizations fit into all of this? Remember that where we have bibliographic metadata standards that are very high level, global or universal as the LRM has it, they're likely to have entities, elements, etc. That do not need to be used for a particular application, and that the method for indicating which are the appropriate elements is to create an application profile. However, application profiles, one mechanism for using them is to cascade them. It's possible to create a core profile, and this is not an unfamiliar concept. This is rather like a minimum input standard for a bibliographic record. It can be added to, but should not be detracted from. So at national level, an application profile could consist of a set of core profiles, selecting appropriate entities, elements, and content guidelines for different kinds of material. There are many different ways of splitting this up. I've said traditionally here it could be an application profile for printed volumes, books, a separate profile for sound recordings, etc., etc. However, particular specific libraries at local level may require additional entities, elements, constraints, and content guidelines for their particular purposes. And so they are likely to create their own application profiles, which could be based, if the national level is coordinating everything, could be based at that national level. I suggested here that specific local profiles could be created for specific sectors, but again, there are different ways of doing it. So what we see here is the national level, and surely it's national agencies who operate at this level, provides a bridge between the global metadata ecosystem and the local metadata ecosystem via application profiles. So in conclusion, A model ontology requires refinement and extension to provide the entities and elements required for practical application. Legacy entities and elements can be accommodated within an operational ontology by subtyping and shortcuts, and there are various other mechanisms that can be used. Application profiles are required to select entities and elements for specific practical applications from an operational ontology with wide coverage, such as RDA or ISBD. And finally, national agencies have an intermediation role between global and local metadata environments in creating and coordinating application profiles. Thank you.
Thanks to Gordon. And I invite you to questions or discussion. A library reference model really isn't my area. So I'm asking fellow librarians maybe get actively involved. If there are no further questions or comments, I thank Gordon once again for being with us this time as well. And thank you very much. Maybe Gordon?
Okay. Hi, Gordon.
Hi, Gordon.
Nice to see you again.
Yeah.
Like you said, at least in a small Zoom screen. Hope to see you in vivo soon. Okay.
Yeah.
So you mentioned cross relations between different ontologies. So how you okay, CDOC CRM is already available in RDF format and in the context of LRM object-oriented model, and how you can see this alignment or harmonization between those two models or ontologies, especially in terms of presenting some place-time concepts. As we know, CDOC CRM is event-oriented ontology. So in this LRM-O document, I saw some event types and event elements, but some are deprecated, some are new. So please, if you can explain or say your vision of this alignment and harmonization.
Yeah, we're basically trusting the other community to ensure that any development, so that this is an interesting thing, because if there's an ontology, if you're using an ontology developed by somebody else, then what do you do when they change the ontology? It upsets your application. So this is a very practical question. However, from an RDA point of view, we have a protocol with the Bibliographic Conceptual Models Review Group, which administers and develops the LRM, both the LRM-ER, the entity relationship version, and the object-oriented version. However, over the past 2 years, the CDOC CRM has undertaken a fairly radical transformation of the CRM, its underlying principles and structure. It's not surfaced in any difference. And one of those things was to stop using what were called extensions to the CRM, and LRM-OO was an official extension to the CRM. And instead, they have been folding in as many of the extensions as possible where they have general application to museum documentation. So it's not only the LRM that's being folded into, there's also, I mean, I'm on the list, I lurk on the list, and there's SOC-SCI, you know, the social sciences ontology is being folded in, etc. So the LRM is basically being absorbed into the CRM. But the BCM review group at IFLA assure us that it will remain compatible with LRM entity relationship, and then that cascades down to RDA and ISBD. What I'm about to say could be technically incorrect, so I apologize if I get this wrong. But I believe that one of the ways of flattening the events-based model of the CRM is to use shortcuts. You shortcut through the event and you connect the input to the output without specifying what the event is. And I believe that mechanism, that shortcut mechanism, in fact, dumbs down the object orientation of the CIDOC CRM into the flatter entity relationship model, which I think is more useful currently for libraries to implement, because entity relationship modeling is somewhat a basic thing within library metadata. So that's how I see it. First of all, there has to be a political relationship. You have to have trust that the ontology you're using is going to remain, is not going to break everything, all your applications. But also there are these very simple mechanisms which can be applied to ensure that the different methodologies of the ontology, object orientation or event-driven to entity relationship, non-event driven views of the world, that ensures that things remain in harmony. However, from time to time, a quantum leap or paradigm shift will be required, but they're every 25 to 30 years. So the CRM is just settling down into its new structure. RDA is just settling down, and ISBD won't be far behind. So we're hoping that once all of this implementation is done, that things will become stable for a few years.
And also recording context for archival it's also in development process, and yeah, also contains events and similar modeling principles.
Yeah,
to some extent.
Yeah. The truth of the matter is that library metadata really doesn't have to pay any attention to events. We're only interested in recorded information. That is stuff I've already pointed out. The RDA makes a split in the event that causes an unpublished manifestation to appear versus the event that causes a mechanically reproduced. So these are technically events, I guess. They have players, the publisher is a craftsman or a printer, etc., etc., etc. So these different approaches, I'm fascinated by this, because these different views of the world are actually all just, you know, one elephant and different views of the elephant in the room. So it would be great if we can all converge on a single model like the CRM. I agree, the CRM is the supreme model, by the way. I think that's the one that we should all be trying to be compatible with.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon. There is one question for you on chat. So if you can answer.
Yeah, so the question in chat is, could accommodating legacy elements become overwhelming because things change constantly? Yeah, it's a very good question. there is a danger if you retain every legacy element, then you are basically taking a previous view of the world and mixing it with a current view of the world. And sometimes that can become unwieldy. I'll give you one example from RDA. I said that RDA tried to retain its legacy elements, but there was one specific instance where the decision was made not to do this, and that was with very granular relationship elements. During the implementation of the LRM, RDA got rid of very granular elements such as what did we have? Author of preface, author of postface. These were deemed to be too granular for RDA's purposes, and therefore they were gotten rid of. So RDA did actually drop some legacy elements. I think the answer is it's up to the implementation. Again, I think a national agency has significant input to make here. The question is overwhelming for who? It might be overwhelming for one application, but not for another application. And I think national agencies do have a role here to determine what the balance is. So that as ontologies, element sets, and content standards evolve, clearly national agencies should be having some input into that development. And I think that is how you balance, how you retain the best of the past into the present, but make sure that you don't overwhelm the present with the past.
Okay, anyone else? If not, thanks Gordon again.
Yeah.
We move on.